Lena's phone buzzed angrily on the kitchen counter, the vibration cutting through the quiet of her small apartment. She hesitated for a moment before picking it up, already knowing what was coming. The second she answered, her mother's voice exploded through the speaker, sharp and accusing. "How could you do this to me, Lena?" Margaret demanded, skipping any pleasantries. "Do what?" Lena asked, gripping the edge of the counter as if to steady herself. "You know exactly what I'm talking about. A trip to South Africa, and you didn't even bother to book me a private villa? I'm stuck in some standard lodge like a common tourist? What kind of daughter does that?" Lena inhaled deeply, closing her eyes for a brief second. She had spent years sacrificing, budgeting, and planning this trip for her mother, believing it would finally earn her a shred of appreciation. Flights, luxury safaris, 5-star accommodations. Everything had been meticulously arranged, but, as always, it wasn't enough. "Mom, I paid for the entire trip," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "You have private game drives, gourmet meals, and a beautiful suite. Do you even realize how much effort went into this?" Margaret scoffed on the other end, her tone dripping with disdain. "Oh, please, Claire would have done it right. She would have made sure I had first-class everything. That's what a good daughter does." The words cut through Lena like a blade, even though she had heard similar ones her entire life. Claire, her younger sister, the golden child, had always been Margaret's favorite, despite Claire's lack of financial stability, responsibility, or effort. She was adored simply for existing. Meanwhile, Lena had spent years being the responsible one, the planner, the provider. Yet, no matter how much she gave, it was never enough. This trip had been her last-ditch effort to show her mother she cared, to prove that she wasn't the cold, ungrateful daughter Margaret always made her out to be. And now, standing in her tiny apartment, holding the phone to her ear, she realized the truth. No gesture, no sacrifice, no expense would ever make her mother see her differently. Margaret's voice grew sharper. "Honestly, Lena, I don't know what's wrong with you. You're so selfish. Maybe, if you ever grow up, you'll figure out how to treat people properly." A lump formed in Lena's throat, but she forced herself to swallow it down. She refused to let Margaret hear the hurt in her voice. "I hope you enjoy the trip," she said simply, then hung up before she could say something she would regret. She stood frozen for a moment, staring at the silent phone in her hand. The usual wave of guilt and self-doubt began creeping in, but this time something was different. Maybe, just maybe, it was time for Margaret to understand just how wrong she was. Lena had spent her entire life trying to be the good daughter, the responsible one, the dependable one, the one who always put family first. Growing up in a modest home, she quickly learned that love in her family wasn't freely given. It had to be earned. Margaret had made that clear from an early age. Claire, with her effortless charm and carefree nature, had always been the favorite. She didn't have to try. She could forget birthdays, ignore responsibilities, and still be showered with affection. But Lena had to prove her worth every single day. When she was a child, she believed good grades would make her mother proud, so she buried herself in books, earning straight A's while Claire barely scraped by. Yet whenever report cards came home, Margaret would only glance at Lena's and nod. "Claire has such a warm personality," she would say instead, patting her younger daughter's head. "Not everything is about grades, you know." It was as if Lena's efforts were invisible, no matter how hard she tried. By the time she was a teenager, she realized that approval wouldn't come from academic success alone, so she threw herself into household responsibilities. While Claire spent weekends at the mall with friends, Lena stayed home, cooking meals, cleaning the house, and making sure Margaret had everything she needed. She learned to anticipate her mother's moods, knowing when to tread carefully, when to offer comfort, and when to disappear. She thought maybe if she just did enough, if she was good enough, helpful enough, perfect enough, her mother would finally look at her the way she looked at Claire. But it never happened. Even as she worked multiple jobs in college to support herself, while Claire called home asking for money every other week, Margaret still found ways to criticize her. "You work too much," she'd say dismissively. "That's why you don't have a husband. No man wants a woman who's always busy." When Lena landed a stable job as a restaurant manager and moved into her own apartment, she thought maybe this time Margaret would recognize her success. But instead of pride, she was met with indifference. "Claire's traveling now," Margaret would say whenever Lena tried to share an achievement. "She just got back from Italy. Can you imagine? I always knew she'd live an exciting life." It didn't matter that Claire was hopping between freelance gigs, barely scraping by. To their mother, Claire could do no wrong. Meanwhile, Lena had worked tirelessly for everything she had, yet she was still the one being told she wasn't doing enough. This trip to South Africa had been Lena's final attempt at earning some kind of validation. It had taken years of saving, skipping vacations and cutting back on personal luxuries to afford the kind of experience Margaret always dreamed of: a 5-star lodge, exclusive guided safaris, fine dining, all things Margaret had gushed about when watching travel documentaries. Lena thought that maybe, just maybe this time, her mother would appreciate the effort. She had imagined Margaret calling her after landing, her voice warm with gratitude, saying, "Lena, this is incredible. I can't believe you did this for me." But instead, all she got was scorn for not booking a private villa. The realization hit her like a gut punch. Her mother had never seen her sacrifices, and she never would. The years of bending over backward, the endless need to prove herself, it had all been for nothing. Lena sat in her dimly lit apartment, her fingers gripping a steaming mug of tea that had long since gone cold. The silence around her was deafening, broken only by the occasional hum of the refrigerator. The conversation with her mother replayed in her head on an endless loop. Margaret's scornful words, the disappointment dripping from her voice, the ever-present comparison to Claire. No matter how much Lena did, it was never enough. The thought clawed at her, tightening around her chest like a vice. She had worked overtime shifts, skipped vacations, and budgeted every spare penny to give her mother this once-in-a-lifetime trip. And for what? A complaint about not having a private villa? An insult about how Claire would have done better? Lena had spent her entire life trying to prove herself, but at that moment she realized something chilling. Her mother didn't want proof. Margaret had already decided that Lena wasn't enough, and nothing she did would ever change that. A deep exhaustion settled over her, heavier than anything she had felt before. She had spent years bending over backward for a woman who would never appreciate her, sacrificing her time, energy, and happiness for a person who only saw her as an obligation. The anger simmered beneath her skin, not just at her mother, but at herself, for allowing it to happen for so long. She glanced at her laptop, the confirmation email for Margaret's trip still open on the screen. Flights, luxury accommodations, safari tours, it was all there, meticulously planned down to the last detail. But then her eyes landed on the return flight. Next to it, in small blue letters, was a button that read, "Manage Booking." Her heart pounded in her chest as an idea flickered in the back of her mind, wild and reckless but so incredibly tempting. She clicked on the button, her fingers hovering over the cancel flight option. Was this too much? Was it cruel? Margaret would be stranded in South Africa, forced to figure out her own way home. But then Margaret's voice echoed in her mind again. "You're selfish. Maybe if you ever grow up, you'll figure out how to treat people properly." The anger surged forward again, burning away the hesitation. Margaret had never once thought about how Lena felt, never once worried about how her words affected her. She had no problem making Lena feel like she was never good enough, so why should Lena feel guilty about finally setting a boundary? With a deep breath, she clicked Cancel. A confirmation message flashed across the screen. "Your request has been processed. This flight has been successfully canceled." Her inbox immediately chimed with a new email. "Your flight change confirmation." It was done. A strange feeling settled over Lena, one she hadn't expected. relief. For the first time in years, she felt a flicker of control, like she had taken back a piece of herself that had long been lost. Margaret wouldn't even realize what had happened until she was at the airport, ready to check in. And when she did, for the first time in her life, she would have to deal with the consequences of her entitlement. Lena sat back, her fingers still resting on the trackpad. Was this petty? Maybe, but was it necessary? Absolutely. Margaret needed to understand that Lena wasn't her personal doormat, someone she could berate and manipulate without repercussions. And more than that, Lena needed to understand it for herself. She wasn't just the daughter who gave and gave without expecting anything in return. She deserved respect. She deserved recognition. And if Margaret refused to give it, then maybe it was time she learned what it felt like to be left hanging. As she closed the laptop, a small smile played at the corners of Lena's lips. Margaret wanted to treat her like a disposable afterthought? Fine. Now it was Margaret's turn to feel forgotten. For the next few days, Lena stayed silent, watching from the sidelines as her mother flaunted her lavish trip on social media. Margaret had wasted no time flooding her Facebook and Instagram with posts, each one dripping with self-indulgence. "Living my best life on an exclusive safari," she captioned a photo of herself standing beside a luxury safari jeep, dressed in designer sunglasses and a sun hat. Dreams do come true. Another post showed an extravagant 5-course dinner, the caption reading, "Fine dining under the African sky." Perfection. Not once did she mention Lena. There were no posts about the daughter who had meticulously planned every detail of this trip, no words of thanks, no acknowledgement of the sacrifices that had made it possible. The closest thing to crediting Lena was a vague tag in her first post, "So grateful for this amazing experience." But the name next to it wasn't even Lena's, it was Claire's. Lena stared at her phone, shaking her head with a mix of disbelief and resignation. Of course Margaret had given Claire the spotlight. Claire, who had contributed nothing to this trip, who hadn't lifted a single finger to plan it. And yet, Margaret wanted the world to think Claire was the doting daughter who had made it all happen. Lena had expected this, but it didn't make it sting any less. This is just how she is, she reminded herself. She refused to let it ruin her sense of satisfaction. Margaret was enjoying her dream vacation, blissfully unaware of the storm waiting for her at the airport. A few days later, Lena received a text from Claire. "Mom is having the time of her life. She keeps saying how much she loves this trip. She's been raving about it to everyone." Lena read the message twice before replying with a short, "Glad she's enjoying herself." She meant it, at least partially. If Margaret was happy, good for her. But the real moment Lena was waiting for wasn't the vacation itself. It was what would happen when Margaret tried to come home. She imagined the scene vividly, her mother strolling confidently up to the airline counter, expecting first-class treatment, only to be told there was no ticket under her name. She imagined Margaret's confusion turning to frustration, her entitled demands met with nothing but polite shrugs from the staff. Would she assume it was a mistake? Would she lash out at the airline, trying to make someone else fix the situation for her? Or would she finally, for the first time in her life, understand what it felt like to be disregarded and left to fend for herself? Whatever happened, Lena knew one thing for sure. Her mother was about to learn a lesson she wouldn't forget. Margaret strutted through the Johannesburg airport, her confidence as high as ever. After days of indulging in luxury, she was ready to return home and bask in the attention of her friends, telling them all about her grand African adventure. She wheeled her designer luggage to the check-in counter, not a single worry on her mind. The airline attendant smiled politely as she took Margaret's passport and typed into the computer. Then her smile faltered. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I don't see a return flight booked under your name." Margaret frowned. "That's impossible. My daughter booked this entire trip for me. There should be a business class ticket home." The attendant typed again, then shook her head. "No, ma'am. It appears that your return ticket was canceled." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean, cancelled?" she demanded, her voice rising. The attendant maintained her professional demeanor. "The reservation was changed a few days ago. There is no return flight scheduled for you." Margaret's stomach twisted. This had to be a mistake. She reached for her phone with shaking hands and immediately dialed Lena. When her daughter answered, her voice was calm, almost too calm. "Mom," Lena said. "What's wrong?" Margaret exhaled sharply. "What's wrong?" "My flight home is cancelled. The airline is saying I don't have a ticket. Fix this." There was a brief silence on the other end before Lena spoke again, her voice devoid of the usual urgency she had when solving her mother's problems. "Oh, that," she said lightly. "Yeah, I cancelled it." Margaret blinked, her grip on the phone tightening. "You what?" she hissed, her voice so sharp that the airline attendant took a step back. "I cancelled it," Lena repeated. "Since you called me a selfish daughter and made it clear that I wasn't good enough, I figured you wouldn't want anything from me anymore. So I stopped paying for things." Margaret's face burned with fury. "Lena, don't play games with me. I'm at the airport. I need a flight home. This is humiliating." "Humiliating?" Lena's voice remained steady. "You mean like how you humiliated me when I paid for this entire trip and you still told me I wasn't good enough? When you told me Claire would have done better? When you acted like my efforts meant nothing?" Margaret's mouth opened, but no words came out. For the first time in her life, she wasn't the one in control. Her daughter, the one who had always bent over backward to accommodate her, was standing her ground. Margaret's voice dropped, shifting from anger to desperation. "Lena, I didn't mean it like that. You know I appreciate everything you do for me. I was just frustrated." "Frustrated?" Lena echoed. "Well, now you know how I've felt for years." Margaret was out of arguments. She looked around the airport, suddenly hyper-aware of the curious stares from the people nearby. Her face flushed with embarrassment. "Lena, please," she said, her voice softer now. "I need to get home." "You'll figure it out, Mom," Lena said simply. "You always do." And with that, she hung up. Margaret stood frozen at the airport counter, her mind racing as she stared at her silent phone. Lena had hung up. She actually hung up on me. For the first time in her life, Margaret felt an unfamiliar sensation creeping in, powerlessness. She wasn't used to being ignored. She had always been the one in control, the one who set the rules, the one who commanded attention. But now she was just another stranded traveler with no way home. Panic bubbled in her chest as she turned back to the airline attendant. "There must be some mistake," she insisted, trying to mask the tremble in her voice. "I need a flight back to the States, immediately." The attendant, who had clearly seen her fair share of frantic customers, gave her a polite but firm smile. "The next available flight is in 3 days, ma'am, and last-minute tickets are quite expensive. Would you like to book one?" Margaret's heart pounded. 3 days? Expensive? She hadn't even considered money. She had always just relied on Lena to handle those details. How much?" she asked hesitantly. The attendant typed on her keyboard, then turned the screen toward her. The number staring back at Margaret made her stomach drop. She didn't have that kind of money, not on her own. She had always assumed Lena would be there to take care of things as she always had, but now she was stranded, and for the first time in her life, she had no one to call for help. Except Claire. With shaky fingers, she pulled up her messages and texted her younger daughter. "Claire, I need you to book me a flight home, ASAP. Lena canceled my return ticket. Call me now." She waited, tapping her foot impatiently, but no response came. 10 minutes passed, then 20, then 30. Claire had read the message. Margaret could see the red receipt, but still nothing. A wave of nausea hit her as realization sank in. Claire wasn't going to swoop in and fix this. Claire, her golden child, her favorite, the one she always praised over Lena, wasn't answering. Margaret sank into one of the plastic airport chairs, feeling something she hadn't felt in years: abandoned. She was used to being taken care of, to having someone else handle the hard parts of life, but now she was just another person sitting alone in an airport, waiting, and waiting, and waiting. As exhaustion set in, she thought back to Lena's words, the cold finality in her voice. "Now you know how I've felt for years." It played in her mind like a haunting melody, over and over again. Had she really been that blind? Had she really dismissed Lena's sacrifices so easily? Memories flashed through her mind. Lena working late shifts to support the family. Lena skipping vacations so she could afford nicer things for Margaret. Lena always being the one to plan, to organize, to make sure everything ran smoothly. And what had Margaret done in return? Called her selfish? Told her she wasn't good enough? Margaret closed her eyes, swallowing the lump in her throat. Maybe Lena wasn't the problem. Maybe she was. Her phone buzzed in her hand, and for a brief moment, hope flickered in her chest. But it wasn't Claire. It wasn't Lena. It was just another automated airline notification. She was truly alone now, and for the first time in her life, Margaret had to face the consequences of her own entitlement. Margaret sat in the dimly lit airport lounge, staring blankly at the floor. Her phone lay silent beside her, the screen dark, untouched for hours. The reality of her situation had fully sunk in. She had no flight home, no money for a last-minute ticket, and no one rushing to save her. Claire hadn't responded, and Lena had made it clear that she was done. For the first time in her life, Margaret had to face something she had always avoided: accountability. The truth was bitter but undeniable. She had taken Lena for granted. All these years she had demanded more, expected more, always believing that Lena's role in life was to serve her without complaint. But now, stranded and humiliated, she saw it for what it was. Lena had given her everything, and she had given Lena nothing in return but criticism and comparison. A sharp pang of regret coursed through her. How could I have been so blind? Swallowing her pride, she picked up her phone and hesitated for only a moment before typing out a message. "Lena, I don't know what else to say, but I'm sorry. I know I've hurt you. I know I've been unfair. I just want to come home. Please." She stared at the message before pressing send, her hands trembling slightly. Would Lena even respond? Would she ignore her the way Margaret had ignored her feelings for so many years? Minutes passed, stretching into what felt like an eternity. Then finally her phone buzzed. Margaret's heart pounded as she read Lena's reply. "I'll book you a flight home, but this is the last time I'm doing something like this for you. If you can't start treating me with respect, don't expect me to keep bending over backward for you." Margaret exhaled, a mix of relief and shame washing over her. This wasn't the instant forgiveness she had secretly hoped for. Lena wasn't welcoming her back with open arms, pretending that nothing had happened. No, this was different. This was Lena standing her ground, making it clear that if Margaret wanted her in her life, things had to change. Margaret typed quickly, her fingers uncharacteristically unsure. "Thank you. I'll do better, I promise." And this time, as she hit send, she meant it. Whether Lena believed her or not was another matter, but Margaret knew one thing for certain. She couldn't afford to lose her daughter. Not now, not ever. Margaret stepped off the plane, gripping the handle of her carry-on tightly as she scanned the crowd. She had expected to take a taxi home, assuming Lena wouldn't be there to pick her up. But then, to her surprise, she spotted her daughter standing near the arrivals gate, arms crossed, an unreadable expression on her face. Margaret hesitated for a moment before walking toward her, her usual confident stride replaced by something slower, almost uncertain. As she reached Lena, she cleared her throat. "Hi," she said, her voice softer than usual. Lena gave a small nod. "Hi, Mom." There was no warmth, no hostility, just a quiet, neutral tone that Margaret couldn't quite decipher. They walked toward the car in silence, the weight of the past week hanging between them like an unspoken truth. Margaret, for once, didn't fill the quiet with complaints or passive-aggressive remarks. Instead, she let herself sit with the discomfort. As they merged onto the highway, Margaret finally spoke. "Lena, I owe you an apology." She turned slightly, catching her daughter's side profile in the dim glow of the dashboard. "I treated you horribly, and I took everything you did for granted. You didn't deserve that." Lena remained silent for a moment before exhaling slowly. "No, I didn't." Her response was firm, not bitter, just a simple acknowledgement of truth. Margaret swallowed hard. "When I was stuck at that airport, I realized something. You've always been there for me, even when I didn't appreciate it. And Claire," she paused, shaking her head. "Claire didn't even pick up the phone." Lena's fingers tightened slightly on the steering wheel, but she said nothing. Margaret sighed. "I know I can't undo the past, but I want to try to be better. I hope it's not too late." Lena finally glanced at her, her expression unreadable. "It's not too late," she said. "But things have to be different." Margaret nodded quickly, the desperation in her chest easing slightly. "Fair enough." As they pulled into the driveway, Margaret hesitated before getting out of the car. She turned to Lena one last time. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet. "For everything." Lena gave a small nod, but didn't respond. As Margaret stepped inside her home, she felt something new settle over her. Not just relief, but a quiet understanding that for the first time in years, her daughter wasn't bending to her will. This time, if she wanted to keep Lena in her life, she would have to earn it. The days following Margaret's return felt different. Quieter, more measured. For years, Lena's relationship with her mother had been a constant battle for validation, a never-ending cycle of giving without appreciation. But something had shifted. Margaret no longer called demanding favors or guilt-tripping Lena into doing things for her. Instead, when she did reach out, it was with something new: respect. The first time Margaret called after settling in, her voice was almost hesitant. "How's work?" she asked, an unfamiliar sincerity lacing her tone. Lena had braced herself for the usual passive-aggressive remark that followed, something about how she was too busy or neglecting family. But it never came. Instead, her mother simply listened. It was a small change, but it felt significant. Lena, too, had changed. She no longer felt the compulsion to bend over backward to please her mother. When Margaret casually hinted at wanting to be taken out for dinner, Lena simply responded, "Maybe another time," without offering an immediate solution. And, surprisingly, Margaret didn't push. It was as if she was beginning to understand that Lena's time and energy weren't hers to take for granted anymore. Even Claire, usually oblivious to the dynamic, had noticed. "Mom's different," she remarked one evening over coffee. "What did you do to her?" Lena only smiled. For the first time in her life, Lena was no longer living under the weight of her mother's expectations. She spent more time focusing on herself, reconnecting with friends, picking up hobbies she had long abandoned, even planning a vacation for herself, a real one, not one designed to impress someone else. The old guilt that had once gnawed at her every time she set a boundary had started to fade. She wasn't being cruel, she was simply reclaiming the space in her own life. Margaret was trying, and that was more than Lena had ever expected. But whether or not she fully changed didn't matter as much anymore. What mattered was that Lena had changed. She no longer needed to prove her worth to her mother. She had finally learned that she was enough, with or without Margaret's approval, and in that newfound self-assurance, Lena found something she had been searching for her whole life: peace. One evening, Lena sat on her balcony, a cup of tea warming her hands as she watched the city lights flicker in the distance. The air was crisp, carrying a sense of clarity that mirrored how she felt inside. For the first time in years, there was no tension coiling in her stomach, no lingering anxiety over her mother's next complaint or criticism. She had spent so much of her life chasing Margaret's approval, bending over backward to prove her worth, only to realize that she had been measuring herself against an impossible standard. Now, she no longer needed to. Her phone buzzed beside her, a message from her mother. "Hope you had a good day. Just wanted to say thanks again for everything you've done for me." Simple, uncomplicated, and for once, not laced with expectation. Lena smiled to herself, but she didn't feel the need to respond immediately. Instead, she took a deep breath, allowing herself to enjoy the quiet moment. She wasn't naive. Margaret would never completely change, and there might still be moments of old habits creeping back in. But the difference now was that Lena had boundaries. She had given herself permission to step back, to protect her peace, to live her life on her own terms. Whether or not her mother ever fully understood the depth of her sacrifices no longer mattered. Lena understood her own worth, and that was enough. She set her tea down, opened her laptop, and smiled as she booked a vacation, one just for herself. This time, for the first time, she was doing something only for her. And it felt good. The story of Lena and Margaret highlights a powerful lesson about self-worth, boundaries, and emotional independence. For years, Lena believed that if she just did enough, worked harder, sacrificed more, gave endlessly, her mother would finally see her value. But no matter how much she gave, it was never enough. The moment Lena decided to cancel Margaret's return flight was not an act of cruelty, but of self-preservation. It was the first time she put herself first, forcing her mother to experience the consequences of entitlement. The lesson here is that love and respect should never be transactional. We cannot earn validation from people unwilling to give it freely. Lena learned that setting boundaries was not about punishing her mother, but about reclaiming her own peace. Margaret, in turn, realized that unconditional support is not an entitlement, and gratitude should not be an afterthought. True change begins when we recognize our own worth and refuse to let others define it. Lena's journey teaches us that walking away from toxic patterns is sometimes the only way to find clarity and self-respect. In the end, she didn't need her mother's approval. She only needed her own.